What Capernaum was like in the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago, a biblical documentary. That is not just a title, that is an invitation. An invitation to cross the threshold of time itself, to walk the same streets, breathe the same salty air from the Sea of Galilee, and stand in the very place where history was forever changed. This is a journey not found in any modern travel guide. This is a journey into the heart of a world that shaped the course of human civilization. And it all begins in one small, dusty, extraordinary town on the northern shore of a freshwater sea in first-century Galilee. This is Capernaum. Imagine waking up before sunrise in a stone house. The walls are thick, made of dark basalt rock pulled from the volcanic earth nearby. The air is cool and carries the smell of fish, charcoal smoke, and the faint mineral scent of the lake. Outside, the first fishermen are already out on the water, their wooden boats cutting through the mist that rolls off the surface of the Sea of Galilee. You can hear the rhythmic slap of oars, the creak of timber, the quiet calls between crew members as they drag their nets through the still pre-dawn darkness. This is not a scene from imagination. This is documented history. This is what life looked like in Capernaum, a fishing village of roughly 1,000 to 1,500 people, positioned at one of the most strategically important crossroads in the ancient Near East. Capernaum sat along the Via Maris, the ancient road of the sea, one of the most heavily traveled trade routes in the ancient world. Caravans from Damascus, merchants from Egypt, soldiers from Rome, they all passed through or near this town. That single geographic reality shaped everything about Capernaum. It made the town cosmopolitan in ways that other Galilean villages simply were not. It brought wealth, diversity, and tension. It made Capernaum a place where different worlds collided, and it made it the perfect stage for the most consequential events in religious history. But before we get to those events, we need to understand the town itself. We need to understand what it felt like to live there, to work there, to be part of that community. Because the more you understand Capernaum as a real, living, breathing place, the more profound everything that happened there becomes. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Here we bring the ancient world back to life with the depth and detail it deserves, turning archaeological discoveries and historical records into immersive journeys that you will not find anywhere else. Subscribe now so you never miss a single story. The physical heart of first-century Capernaum was its synagogue. The building that archaeologists have partially excavated and that tourists visit today is actually a later structure, built in the 4th or 5th century on top of or very near the foundations of an earlier synagogue made of black basalt stone. That earlier synagogue, the one that would have stood in Jesus' time, is believed to have been funded by a Roman centurion, a remarkable act of patronage that we will return to shortly. Synagogues in the 1st century were not only places of prayer and scripture reading, they were the civic centers of Jewish communities. They were courts of justice, they were schools, they were meeting halls, they were the beating heart of community life. When you walked into the synagogue at Capernaum 2,000 years ago, you were walking into the most important building in town. The layout of a 1st century synagogue like this one would have been relatively simple by later standards. Benches lined the interior walls where congregants sat during readings and teachings. At the front, there would have been a place for the Torah scrolls, written by hand on animal skin in careful, precise Hebrew script. Light filtered in through narrow windows. The floor was stone. The atmosphere was serious, reverent, communal. This was a place where men, women, and children gathered to hear the words of Moses, to listen to the prophets, to argue over interpretation, to seek meaning in their often difficult and unpredictable lives. Life in Capernaum was defined by labor. The fishing industry was the economic backbone of the town. The Sea of Galilee, known in ancient times as the Lake of Kinneret, was one of the most productive freshwater fisheries in the ancient world. The lake sits in a basin surrounded by hills and the towering peak of Mount Hermon to the north, creating unique weather patterns that could turn calm waters into sudden storms with very little warning. Fishermen knew this. They respected it. The danger of the lake was not abstract. It was a lived reality that shaped their daily decisions, their prayer lives, their relationship with the divine. The primary fish caught in the lake included a species now called St. Peter's fish, a tilapia-like fish that would have been a staple of the local diet. But fishermen also targeted carp, sardines, and other species using a variety of methods. Cast nets were thrown by a single fisherman standing in shallow water or from the bow of a boat. Dragnet fishing involved larger nets weighted at the bottom and held up by floats, dragged through the water by teams working in coordination. Night fishing was common because many species moved closer to the surface after dark and were more easily caught in the lamplight. A successful night on the water meant income, food security, and the ability to pay the taxes that Rome and the temple authorities demanded. A failed night meant none of those things. The boats used on the Sea of Galilee in this period were relatively small by modern standards, typically around 8 to 9 meters in length and roughly 2.5 meters wide. We know this because one extraordinary boat was discovered in the mud near the shore in 1986, preserved by the unique anaerobic conditions of the lake bed. The boat dates to roughly the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE, placing it squarely in the period we are discussing. It was made from multiple species of wood, suggesting it was repaired and rebuilt over many years. It could hold perhaps a crew of 5 or 6 men comfortably, with space for a sail and oars. Standing next to that ancient vessel in the museum where it is now preserved, you begin to feel the weight of time in a way that no textbook can quite convey. Beyond fishing, Capernaum supported a range of other trades and occupations. There were carpenters, potters, and leather workers. There were merchants who sold goods arriving along the Via Maris and tax collectors who extracted duties from them. There were bakers and weavers and those who processed and salted fish for export to markets throughout the region and beyond. Capernaum was not a city, but it was not merely a sleepy village either. It was a working community with a complex economic ecosystem integrated into the broader networks of Galilee, Judea, and the wider Roman world. The political reality of Capernaum in the time we are discussing was complex. The town sat at the border between 2 administrative territories. To the west was the territory governed by Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, who ruled Galilee and Perea. To the east began the territory of Philip, another of Herod's sons. This border location was economically significant because goods crossing it were subject to customs duties, which is precisely why a tax collector would be stationed there. The Romans had reorganized the entire region following the death of Herod the Great, and the political landscape was a patchwork of client rulers, Roman administrative oversight, and local Jewish governance through institutions like the synagogue. The presence of Rome in Capernaum was not always visible in an obvious military sense, but it was constant and undeniable. Roman soldiers were stationed throughout the region. The taxation system was organized to funnel wealth back toward Rome and the local client rulers. Roman law provided a framework, sometimes a brutal one, for maintaining order. The denarius, a Roman silver coin stamped with the image of the emperor, circulated alongside local and regional currencies. Roman roads connected Capernaum to the broader imperial network of commerce and communication. You could not live in Capernaum and be unaware that you were part of a vast empire centered on a city most of the townspeople would never see, ruled by an emperor whose divine status was regularly proclaimed and who was, from the perspective of Jewish theology, a profound offense against the one God of Israel. This tension between Roman imperial authority and Jewish religious identity was one of the defining features of life in 1st century Galilee. It was not merely political, it was deeply personal and existential. Jewish identity was constructed around the Torah, the covenant between God and Israel, the memory of the Exodus, the promises made to Abraham, and the hope for a messianic restoration. Under Roman occupation, all of those themes, liberation, justice, divine faithfulness, the reversal of oppression, took on an urgent, immediate relevance that they might not have had in times of greater political autonomy. People in Capernaum were not passive recipients of religious tradition. They were actively wrestling with what it meant to be the people of God in a world that seemed, on the surface, to be governed by imperial force rather than divine justice. Into this world, a young man arrived from a small town roughly 40 kilometers to the southwest. His name, in the Aramaic that was the common spoken language of Galilee, was Yeshua. In Greek, the language of much of the empire, it became Jesus. In the Latin of Rome and the later Western Church, it became Isus. In the English translation familiar to billions of people throughout history, he is known as Jesus. According to the Gospel accounts, which are the primary textual sources for his life, Jesus made Capernaum something close to a home base during his public ministry. After beginning his ministry in the region of the Jordan River and spending time in his hometown of Nazareth, he settled in Capernaum. The Gospel of Matthew describes it explicitly. Leaving Nazareth, he came and lived in Capernaum, which is by the sea in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. For the author of Matthew, this was not merely a practical residential decision. It was the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. But whatever the theological framing, the historical core of the statement is significant. Capernaum became the center of his activity. Why Capernaum? From a purely practical perspective, the town offered significant advantages. Its position on the Via Maris meant that news and teaching could spread quickly through the network of travelers and traders passing through. The fishing community provided a ready base of followers and supporters, including some of his closest companions. The presence of a functioning synagogue gave him a regular, established venue for teaching. And the border location meant he was operating in a zone that was somewhat less directly under the thumb of either Herod Antipas or the Jerusalem religious authorities, at least initially, giving him a degree of room to operate that might not have been available in more politically central locations. The people Jesus encountered in Capernaum were not abstractions. They were specific human beings with names, families, and histories. Among them were Simon, known by the Greek name Peter, and his brother Andrew, fishermen by trade who worked the lake with their father and partners. There were also James and John, the sons of a man named Zebedee, also fishermen, who according to the Gospels left their boats and their father and joined Jesus when he called to them from the shore. The abruptness and completeness of this decision has fascinated readers and scholars for centuries. What did they see in him? What did he say or do in that moment that made grown men with families and livelihoods walk away from everything they knew and follow a teacher they had perhaps only just met? The answer is not simple and probably not singular. It likely involved the combination of his personal presence, his teaching, and the broader atmosphere of messianic expectation that saturated Jewish life in this period. Levi, the tax collector, is another figure associated with Capernaum. He sat at his tax booth, presumably near the border crossing, or at a key point along the Via Maris, collecting customs on goods passing through. Tax collectors in first-century Jewish society occupied an uncomfortable position. They were agents of the Roman economic system, and often of the local client rulers, which made them figures of suspicion and resentment in communities that chafed under the burden of taxation. They were considered to have compromised their purity and their community loyalty by handling Roman money and collaborating with the occupying power. Whatever Levi's personal feelings about his profession, it was not a job that earned social admiration. When Jesus invited him to follow, and Levi did, it was a moment that seemed to violate the expected categories. Teachers of Torah were not supposed to associate with tax collectors. They were not supposed to eat with them, share fellowship with them, treat them as worthy of the same divine attention as the more obviously righteous members of the community. That Jesus did exactly these things is one of the clearest and most historically well-attested features of his public activity. The physical setting for so much of what happened in Capernaum was the lakeside. Imagine standing on the shore as the morning mist burns off the water. The sun rises to the east over the hills that lead toward the Decapolis and beyond. The air is warm, but not yet the intense heat of midday. Fishing boats are being pulled up onto the beach. Nets are spread out to dry, mended, inspected for tiers. The smell of fish and wood smoke is in the air. Children run along the shore, women carry water jars, men argue over prices at a small market. And in the middle of this ordinary morning, something extraordinary is beginning. Now, a deep breath. We are going to go further into the daily rhythms of Capernaum, into its homes, its meals, its social structures, and the deeper currents of faith and expectation that ran beneath the surface of ordinary life. Because understanding those currents is essential to understanding what made Capernaum the epicenter of something that would eventually reach across the entire world. If you have been watching up to this point, you already know that this channel does not settle for surface-level history. We go deep. We go wide. We take you somewhere real. So stay with us. The houses of Capernaum were built to last. Constructed from the dense black basalt stone that underlies much of the landscape around the Sea of Galilee, they were sturdy, dark, and efficient. Archaeologists excavating the site in the 20th century uncovered an extraordinarily well-preserved neighborhood of these houses, their walls still standing to significant heights, their floor plans intact enough to reconstruct with considerable confidence how people actually lived. A typical house in Capernaum was not a single room, but rather a cluster of rooms built around a central courtyard. The courtyard was the social and functional heart of the household. Cooking was done there, often over an open hearth or in a clay oven. Animals, particularly goats and chickens, might be kept there. Children played there, women worked there at looms or grinding grain. The indoor rooms were used primarily for sleeping and storage. There was no indoor plumbing in any modern sense. Water was carried from the lake or from wells. Waste was managed in ways that required considerable effort and attention, especially in a densely populated area. Extended families often shared a compound, with multiple nuclear family units living around a shared courtyard or in adjacent houses with connecting doorways. This created a social structure of intense interdependence. Privacy as a modern concept barely existed. Everyone knew everyone's business because everyone shared the same walls, the same courtyard, the same resources. This could be a source of support and solidarity in hard times. It could also be a source of conflict and tension. The texture of daily life was densely social in a way that modern urban and suburban existence often is not. The diet of a family in Capernaum was simple by modern standards, but not necessarily inadequate. Fish, obviously, was central. Fresh fish from the lake, dried fish, salted fish preserved for export and for lean times. Bread was the other staple, made from wheat or barley, ground in the household and baked daily or every few days. Legumes, lentils, chickpeas, broad beans provided essential protein. Olive oil was used for cooking, for light, and for 100 other practical purposes. Olives themselves, grown on the slopes of the surrounding hills, were eaten directly or pressed. Figs, dates, pomegranates, and grapes were available seasonally. Wine was the common beverage, diluted with water as was the Mediterranean custom. Meat, primarily from goats and sheep, was eaten occasionally, often in connection with religious festivals and community celebrations. It was a diet built around availability, preservation, and community sharing rather than individual preference. The rhythms of the week were organized around the Sabbath, the seventh day of rest that was one of the most fundamental markers of Jewish identity and practice. From sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday, work was set aside. The Sabbath was not merely a day off work in any secular sense. It was a holy day, a time of prayer, of Torah study, of family, of community. The synagogue service on the Sabbath morning was the central social and spiritual event of the week. The whole community gathered. The Torah was read aloud in Hebrew and then translated and explained in Aramaic, the spoken vernacular, in a form of teaching called the Targum. Scholarly discussion, sometimes heated, was not only permitted but expected. The rabbis of this period were not distant figures handing down pronouncements from above. They were engaged, accessible, and their teaching was a participatory community process. The annual calendar was also structured around the great pilgrimage festivals. Passover, held in the spring, commemorated the exodus from Egypt and was the most emotionally and politically charged festival of the year, celebrating liberation from slavery while the community was actively living under Roman occupation. The juxtaposition was impossible to miss. Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks, celebrated the giving of the Torah at Sinai and the beginning of the grain harvest. Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall, was a joyful harvest celebration involving the construction of temporary booths and 7 days of festivity. For the pilgrimage festivals, many families from Galilee would have made the journey south to Jerusalem, traveling in large groups through the Jordan Valley, crossing into Judea, and ascending to the Holy City on the hill. The journey from Capernaum to Jerusalem was roughly 130 kilometers. It would have taken several days on foot. It was not a casual outing, but a sacred journey, loaded with anticipation and devotion. The Roman centurion whose presence in Capernaum is recorded in the Gospel accounts is one of the most fascinating figures connected to the town. Roman centurions commanded units of roughly 80 men. They were professional soldiers, career military men who were generally respected even by those who resented Roman rule for their competence, discipline, and often for their personal character. The centurion associated with Capernaum is presented in the Gospels as someone who had developed genuine respect for and relationship with the local Jewish community to the point of funding the construction of the town's synagogue. This is corroborated by the archaeological evidence, which suggests the synagogue was indeed a substantial structure funded by patronage. He appears in the narrative with a servant who is seriously ill, and the story that unfolds is one of the most noted exchanges in the entire gospel tradition. The centurion's humility, his confidence, and the outcome of that encounter have been analyzed, debated, and celebrated for 2,000 years. What does it mean that a Roman military officer, a representative of the occupying power, would build a synagogue for the Jewish community of Capernaum? It speaks to the complicated, sometimes surprisingly personal nature of relationships across the lines of political and cultural division. People in occupied territories and occupying forces were not simply representatives of abstract political categories. They were human beings who lived in proximity to each other, who sometimes developed genuine respect and even affection across the lines that official policy drew between them. The centurion of Capernaum is a reminder that the story of this town and of this period is not a simple story of two clearly defined sides, but a complex human narrative full of unexpected connections and surprising grace. The healing stories associated with Capernaum in the gospel accounts are numerous and specific in their detail. There is the account of a man in the synagogue who cried out during a teaching session, disrupting the service and causing consternation among those present. There is the account of Simon Peter's mother-in-law, ill with a fever, lying in the house when the group arrived from the synagogue on a Sabbath afternoon. The story specifies that the Sabbath meal was waiting, that the fever was serious, that the recovery was immediate and complete. She got up and began to serve them. This kind of specific domestic detail is the texture of historical memory. These are not the generic details of mythology. They are the specific details of someone remembering a particular afternoon in a particular house. The house associated with Peter in Capernaum is one of the most significant archaeological discoveries related to the early history of Christianity. Beneath a large 5th-century octagonal church that was clearly built to commemorate a sacred site, archaeologists found evidence of a house from the 1st century that appears to have been used for community gatherings from a very early date. The walls showed layers of plaster that had been applied and reapplied, and the plaster was covered with inscriptions and graffiti in multiple languages, Greek, Aramaic, Syriac, Latin, that appear to be devotional in nature. Fish symbols, boats, and names have been found in the scratched inscriptions. The archaeological evidence suggests that this particular house was venerated and used as a meeting place by the first generations of Jesus' followers, who kept returning to it as a place of memory and significance. Standing in that excavated space today, looking at the ancient stone walls and imagining the community that gathered there, you feel the weight of 2,000 years of continuous memory in a way that is almost impossible to describe. The teaching of Jesus, as recorded in the Gospels, is deeply rooted in the landscape and culture of Capernaum and its surrounding region. The parables, those short, vivid stories used to communicate profound truths, draw on images and situations that would have been immediately familiar to the people of this area. The fishermen sorting their catch at the end of a long night on the lake, the farmer sowing seed on the various kinds of soil found in the fields around Galilee, the woman who loses a coin and sweeps her whole house searching for it, the shepherd who leaves his flock to search for the one sheep that has gone missing. These are not abstract philosophical examples. They are drawn from the lived experience of people who caught fish for a living, who worried about whether their grain would grow, who counted their small coins carefully, who knew the land and its creatures intimately. The genius of the teaching is in this rootedness, this refusal to separate profound spiritual insight from the ordinary textures of daily life. The Sermon on the Mount, one of the most famous discourses in the gospel tradition, is associated with a hillside near the Sea of Galilee, not far from Capernaum. The site traditionally identified with this event is the Beatitudes Hill, where a beautiful church now stands overlooking the lake. Whether or not the precise location is historically accurate, the setting gives a powerful sense of the natural amphitheater that the hillsides around the lake provided, places where a speaker could address a large crowd gathered below, where the acoustics of the landscape carried words across considerable distance. The Beatitudes themselves, those startling declarations about who is truly fortunate, truly blessed, spoke directly to the experience of the people sitting on that hillside. Those who mourn, those who are poor in spirit, those who are meek, those who hunger and seek justice, these were not abstract categories, they were descriptions of people in the crowd. If you have been moved by this journey so far, by the weight of this history and the depth of this world, stop what you are doing and leave a comment below saying exactly this. 2,000 years cannot erase what happened here. Because that is the truth of Capernaum, and saying it together means we are all standing on that shore 2,000 years later, still listening. The social world of Capernaum included those who were marginalized, those who occupied the fringes of the community's life for various reasons. Those with certain illnesses were considered ritually impure, required to maintain distance from the community, according to the purity laws interpreted by the religious authorities of the time. The poor, who were always present in ancient economies, struggled with the grinding pressure of taxation, debt, and the constant uncertainty of agricultural and fishing harvests. Women, though central to household and community life in practice, occupied a formally subordinate position in the public, religious, and political structures of the day. The elderly, the widowed, the orphaned, all of these groups faced particular vulnerabilities in a world without the social safety nets that modern societies, for all their failures, provide. The ministry of Jesus in Capernaum and the surrounding region was notable for its consistent engagement with precisely these marginal groups, for the consistent pattern of treating them as worthy of the same dignity, attention, and concern as those with higher social status. The Pharisees, who appear frequently in the gospel accounts of Jesus' ministry, were one of the significant religious and social movements of first-century Judaism. They were not the villains they are sometimes portrayed as in popular imagination. They were serious, committed Jews who believed deeply in the importance of Torah observance as a way of maintaining Jewish identity and faithfulness under Roman occupation. Their project of extending the purity laws from the temple sphere into everyday domestic life was, in their view, a way of sanctifying the whole of existence, making every meal a kind of priestly service, every home a kind of temple. The debates between Jesus and the Pharisees recorded in the Gospels are often debates between people who share many fundamental commitments to the God of Israel, to the Torah, to the life of the Jewish community, but who differ sharply on interpretation, emphasis, and practice. These are the kinds of debates that happen within families and communities, not simply between enemies. Understanding this makes the debates far more interesting and historically meaningful. The scribes, another group mentioned frequently in the gospel accounts, were the scholars and legal experts of the Jewish world. Their training in the interpretation of Torah was extensive and specialized. When the Gospels report that the crowds were amazed at Jesus' teaching because he taught with authority and not as the scribes did, this is a statement about a quality of directness and personal conviction in his teaching that contrasted with the more cautious, citation-heavy method of the professional scholars. The scribes would typically ground their interpretations in the authority of earlier teachers and traditions. The voice that the gospel accounts preserve in the teaching of Jesus is different. It speaks in its own name, it asserts, it commands, it declares. This was striking and controversial in a world where authority was always supposed to be derived from established tradition. The Sea of Galilee itself was not merely a backdrop to these events, it was an active participant in the stories. Its sudden storms, its calms, its fish, its shores, its capacity to divide communities on opposite banks while also connecting them by water. All of these features are woven into the narrative. The lake was about 21 kilometers long and 13 kilometers wide at its maximum. It was not a vast body of water, but it was large enough to be genuinely dangerous in the sudden storms that could develop when cold air from the surrounding mountains descended onto the warm surface of the lake. Fishermen who had worked these waters their entire lives knew the signs, but the storms could still come faster than they could reach shore. The lake demanded respect, skill, and the kind of collaborative teamwork that builds deep bonds between crew members. The crossing of the lake appears several times in the gospel narratives as a significant movement, from one side to the other, from the Jewish communities on the western shore to the Gentile territories of the Decapolis on the eastern shore and back again. These crossings were not merely geographic. They were symbolic passages across cultural and religious boundaries, moments when the ministry expanded beyond the immediate community of Galilee to engage with the wider world that lay on the other side of the water. The lake was both a boundary and a bridge. The Roman presence in the region was not only military and administrative, it was also cultural. The cities built by the Herods, Tiberias on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, Caesarea Philippi in the north, Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean coast. These were designed according to Greco-Roman architectural principles, complete with temples to Roman gods, theaters, public baths, and the visual language of imperial power. For the observant Jewish population of Capernaum, these cities represented a worldview that was in fundamental tension with their own. The images of Roman gods, the imperial cult, the Hellenistic culture that the Herodian dynasty promoted. These were not neutral cultural options. They were perceived as genuine threats to Jewish identity and faithfulness. The tension between accommodation to the dominant culture and resistance to it was one of the central defining questions of Jewish life in this period. And different groups, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the revolutionary movements, answered it in very different ways. As we move through the chapters of this documentary, we are building not just a picture of a town, but a picture of a world that was small in some ways. Most people in Capernaum would live their entire lives within a radius of perhaps 50 kilometers, and vast in others, connected by trade routes and pilgrimage roads and the flows of imperial power to a civilization that stretched from Britain to Babylon. A world that was ancient in some ways. The Torah that was read in the synagogue was already centuries old. The covenant with Abraham was understood to reach back into a mythic past of unimaginable antiquity, and urgently contemporary in others, confronting the immediate pressures of occupation, taxation, social change, and the competing claims of different religious movements, all insisting they had the key to what God was doing in the present moment. The archaeology of Capernaum has been ongoing for over a century. The Franciscan order acquired the site in the late 19th century and has been involved in its excavation and preservation ever since. A second portion of the site is administered by the Greek Orthodox Church. Together, these excavations have revealed an extraordinary amount about the physical reality of the town. The layout of its streets, the plans of its houses, the remains of its synagogue, the fishing equipment left behind in the sediment, the coins and pottery and small objects of daily life that accumulate in any inhabited place over centuries and millennia. Archaeological work is painstaking and slow. It requires sifting through enormous amounts of earth for fragments of evidence that must then be carefully analyzed, compared, and interpreted in the light of what is already known. But the cumulative result, built up over decades of careful work, is a picture of ancient Capernaum that has more depth and specificity than any previous generation could have imagined. One of the most important recent developments in our understanding of first-century Capernaum has been the analysis of ancient boat-building techniques as revealed by the boat discovered in 1986. The construction methods used in that vessel tell us about the economic conditions of the fishing community. The use of multiple wood species, including some that were not ideal for boat construction, suggests that good timber was scarce and expensive. Boats were repaired extensively rather than replaced. They were valuable assets, probably among the most valuable assets a fishing family would own. The care with which they were maintained and the reluctance to replace them even as they aged tells us something about the economic margins within which the fishing families of Capernaum operated. These were not wealthy people. They were working people, managing their assets carefully in a world where a bad season could mean genuine hardship. The taxation burden on the people of Capernaum and the surrounding Galilean towns was significant. In addition to the taxes owed to Rome, filtered through the client rulers and their administrative apparatus, there were also the religious obligations of the temple in Jerusalem. The half-shekel temple tax was collected annually from every adult Jewish male. This was not an optional contribution, but a required levy. Added to the Roman taxation, the total burden on a fisherman or farmer in Galilee could be substantial, depending on whose estimates you find most convincing. Scholars have debated the exact figures, with estimates ranging widely, depending on assumptions about local conditions and administrative efficiency. What is not debated is that the tax burden was real, that it generated genuine hardship and resentment, and that the figure of the tax collector was not simply a convenient narrative villain, but a real social irritant in communities that felt squeezed between competing demands on their limited resources. The Herodian dynasty's relationship with the Jewish population of Galilee was complicated. Herod Antipas, who ruled during the period of Jesus' ministry, was a son of Herod the Great and had inherited both his father's talent for large-scale building projects and his father's tendency toward self-interested political maneuvering. He built the city of Tiberias on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, naming it in honor of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, in a location that traditional Jewish law considered problematic because it was built over an ancient cemetery. This made the new city ritually impure in the eyes of many observant Jews, a fact that added symbolic insult to the already considerable political and cultural injuries associated with Herodian rule. Antipas divorced his first wife, a Nabatean princess, to marry Herodias, his half-brother's wife, a decision that was both politically complex and, in the view of many Jewish religious authorities, a clear violation of Torah. It was this controversy that brought the prophet known as John the Baptist into fatal conflict with Antipas, and the ripple effects of that conflict shaped the political context within which Jesus' own ministry unfolded. The expectation of a Messiah, an anointed one who would restore Israel and bring in a new age of divine justice and peace, was not a single unified doctrine in first-century Judaism, but rather a cluster of related hopes that different groups articulated in different ways. Some expected a royal Messiah from the line of David who would drive out the Romans and re-establish Israelite sovereignty. Some expected a priestly Messiah who would purify the temple and restore proper worship. Some expected a prophetic figure like Moses who would lead a new exodus. Some, influenced by the apocalyptic writings circulating in this period, expected a cosmic intervention that would end the present age and inaugurate a completely new order of existence. These different strands of expectation were not always clearly distinguished, and they were often combined in complex ways in the minds and writings of actual people. What they shared was a conviction that the present state of affairs, Roman occupation, compromised religious leadership, social injustice, the apparent absence of divine justice, could not be the last word, that the God of Israel was faithful and would act to vindicate his people and establish his purposes. Into this atmosphere of charged expectation, the teaching and activity of Jesus arrived with peculiar force. The claim, explicit or implicit, that in his words and actions, the reign of God was somehow becoming present and active, not in the abstract future, but in the concrete now, in a healing in the synagogue at Capernaum, in a meal shared with tax collectors and those considered outside the boundaries of respectability, in the feeding of hungry crowds on a hillside. This was a claim of extraordinary gravity. Whether people found it convincing, threatening, liberating, or confusing depended on who they were, what they expected, and how they read what they saw and heard. If you have stayed with this documentary through all of this history, through all of these details and layers of ancient life, then you already know something important. You are someone who cares about the deep roots of human civilization, who wants to understand not just what happened, but why it mattered. That makes you exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Subscribe now and join a community of people who take history seriously. The inner circle of Jesus' followers, those who traveled with him constantly and formed the core of his movement, were a remarkably diverse group by the standards of their world. There were fishermen from Capernaum and its immediate environs, Simon Peter, Andrew, James, John. There was Levi the tax collector, who by his profession had been on the opposite side of the political and economic divide from the fishermen. There was Simon the Zealot, a designation that suggests involvement with or sympathy for the revolutionary movements that sought violent resistance to Roman rule, which would have made him politically and ideologically on the opposite end of the spectrum from a tax collector. There was Thomas, whose later tradition associates him with a particular kind of practical, questioning intelligence. There were women among the followers, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and others, whose presence and support were central to the movement's functioning in ways that the later written traditions sometimes undersell but do not entirely erase. The presence of women in this circle was itself significant. In the formal religious structures of first-century Judaism, women's public religious roles were limited, though the picture is more complex than popular imagination sometimes suggests. Women were present and active in synagogue life. They funded religious institutions and causes. They kept the religious practices of the home, which were central to Jewish life. But the formal roles of teaching, legal interpretation, and public religious leadership were, with some exceptions, structured around men. A teacher who traveled with women disciples, who taught them directly, who treated their questions and insights as worth engaging. This was notable and potentially controversial. The Gospels preserve a consistent picture of women as central participants in the ministry, as witnesses to the most pivotal events, as early bearers of the most important messages. Whatever else you conclude about the historical Jesus, the evidence of female discipleship and participation in his movement is among the most historically secure features of what we know about him. The feeding of large crowds with limited food, an event that appears in multiple forms across all 4 gospel accounts, is one of the most discussed and debated miracles in the tradition. What matters for our historical purposes here is the setting and social texture of the events. A crowd of thousands gathered on a hillside near the Sea of Galilee, far from town, running out of food as the afternoon wore on. This is a description of a real social situation that would have required practical management and decision-making. The disciples' concern about feeding the crowd was a genuine logistical problem, not a metaphor. The geography of the setting, the time of day, the presence of the lake nearby, the distribution of food to people sitting in groups on the grass, all of these details have the texture of remembered experience. The tradition is clearly trying to communicate something about abundance, about sharing, about the capacity of divine provision to transcend ordinary scarcity. But it does so through the specific, grounded details of an actual afternoon in Galilee. The healing associated with Capernaum that is perhaps most discussed by theologians and historians is the healing that took place in the synagogue itself, on the Sabbath, in front of the entire assembled community. A man cried out from somewhere in the congregation. The disturbance disrupted the service. The confrontation that followed, and the outcome of that confrontation, left the crowd in a state described in the gospel text as a combination of amazement and something closer to fear. Astonishment at what they had witnessed, combined with the unsettling recognition that something had happened in their presence that they could not immediately fit into their existing categories of understanding. That kind of reaction, somewhere between wonder and confusion, is a very human response to the genuinely unexpected. The departure of Jesus from Capernaum was not a single final event, but a gradual process of increasing tension and eventual movement toward Jerusalem. As his reputation spread, as his teaching became more pointed and his confrontations with various authorities more frequent, the relatively protected sphere of activity that Galilee had provided began to narrow. The trial and execution of John the Baptist by Herod Antipas was a signal of the kind of end that awaited those who challenged power too directly. The increasing opposition of religious authorities in Jerusalem to his teaching and his claims was a gathering storm. The final journey toward Jerusalem, described in careful narrative detail in all 4 Gospels, was undertaken with full awareness, the texts suggest, that it was likely to end badly. Whatever you believe about the metaphysical dimensions of that awareness, the historical plausibility of a figure walking toward confrontation with authorities that had the power to condemn him to the harshest possible punishment is entirely clear from the political and social realities we have been describing throughout this documentary. Capernaum, after the departure of Jesus, was not immediately emptied of significance. The community of his followers continued to use and venerate the house associated with Peter. The town continued its life of fishing, trading, and Sabbath observance. But the movement that had been centered there for a crucial period of its formation began to spread outward, carried by people who had been present in those synagogue teaching sessions, on those hillsides, in those houses, on those boats. The tradition of Capernaum as the center of Jesus' Galilean ministry was preserved carefully in the written Gospels that began to be composed in the decades following his death and the events that followed it. When later pilgrims began making their way to the Holy Land in the centuries after Constantine legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire, Capernaum was one of their primary destinations. The octagonal church built over Peter's house in the 5th century was part of a broader effort to mark and preserve the sites associated with the origins of the faith. The physical fabric of the ancient town became a kind of sacred text, to be read and interpreted by those who came seeking connection with their origins. The ruins of Capernaum today are one of the most significant archaeological sites in Israel. The white limestone columns of the later synagogue, reconstructed and standing against the deep blue sky above the lake, are one of the iconic images of biblical archaeology. The basalt walls of the domestic neighborhood, preserved to shoulder height in places, allow visitors to walk through something very close to the layout of the ancient town. The site is managed thoughtfully, with explanatory signs and reconstructed models that help visitors understand what they are seeing. To walk through Capernaum today is to experience a kind of double vision, the ancient and the present simultaneously present, the ruins speaking quietly of the lives that filled them and the events that made them memorable to generation after generation. The fishing boats still go out on the Sea of Galilee. The water is still that particular shade of blue-green that changes with the light, brilliant under the midday sun, steel gray under clouds, golden at sunset when the reflections stretch across the surface toward the western shore. The hills are still there, the same hills that watched over the town 2,000 years ago, the same hills from which the teaching voices carried on the afternoon wind. The lake is smaller than it used to be. Human demand for its water has lowered the level significantly in recent decades, a reminder that even ancient landscapes are vulnerable to modern pressures. But its essential character endures. The beauty of the setting, the drama of the surrounding landscape, the quality of the light, these things do not change on human timescales. To understand Capernaum fully is to understand that the great events of history do not happen in abstract space. They happen in specific places, among specific people, in the texture of ordinary daily life. They happen in fishing villages where the smell of the lake is in everyone's clothes, where everyone knows everyone's name, where the Sabbath is observed not as an abstraction, but as the organizing rhythm of the week, where children play in the courtyards of basalt houses, and fishermen argue about the best spots on the lake, and tax collectors sit at their booths, and a young teacher from Nazareth walks along the shore and speaks of a kingdom that turns the world's ordinary valuations upside down. If you watch this entire documentary, then you already know why Capernaum matters. You know it not as a collection of facts, but as a living world that you have been allowed to enter, however briefly, however incompletely. History at its best is always an act of imaginative empathy, a willingness to step into another world and take it seriously on its own terms. You have done that today. If you watched this all the way through, it's because you genuinely cared about this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched all the way through," so I can find you and know who really loves the stories on this channel. Your comment means more than you know, and it helps bring stories like this to more people who need to hear them. And if this documentary moved you, if it gave you something, a new image, a new depth of understanding, a renewed sense of wonder at the roots of this tradition, then please give it a like. It takes 1 second and it tells the algorithm that this kind of deep, serious historical storytelling is worth sharing. And then share it. Send it to someone who loves history, someone who is on their own journey of faith, someone who you think would benefit from standing on the shore of the Sea of Galilee for an hour and hearing the wind move through the ancient ruins of a town where something extraordinary began. 2,000 years have passed since a fisherman pulled his nets onto a Galilean shore and heard his name called by a teacher from Nazareth. 2,000 years of argument, devotion, scholarship, art, conflict, and community have flowed from that moment. And here we are, still talking about it, still trying to understand it, still finding in its depths something that speaks to our own lives and our own longings. That is the power of Capernaum. That is the power of history honestly told. Thank you for being here. Subscribe if you have not already. This channel is your home for exactly this kind of journey, and there are many more to come.